The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Inez Talmadge dragged her last quilt off the cedar chest and held it against her chest like a child. She was about to surrender to strangers. She stood in the center of the one-room homestead that her husband Caleb had built with his own 2 hands in the summer of 1878, just 2 years before a fever swept through the Wyoming territory and took him from her in the span of a single terrible week. The cabin walls were thick enough to keep out the worst of the wind, but they could not keep out the cold that seeped through the gaps around the window frame, and they certainly could not keep out the hunger that had been gnawing at her and her daughter Rosie for the better part of a month. Rosie was 7 years old. She sat now by the stove with her knees pulled to her chest and a thin wool blanket wrapped around her small shoulders, watching her mother with eyes that were too serious for a child her age. Children out on the frontier had a way of aging fast. There was no school within 20 miles, no neighbor within 5, and the nearest town of Harrow Creek was a full day's ride in good weather. In weather like this, it might as well have been the moon. "Mama," Rosie said, "are we taking it to town?" Inez smoothed her hand over the surface of the quilt. She had made it herself in the first year of her marriage, when she had still been Inez Whitmore and Caleb Talmadge had been this broad-shouldered young farmer who brought her wildflowers he picked along the creek. She had sewn it from scraps of her wedding dress and Caleb's old work shirts, and a piece of blue calico that his mother had sent from Missouri. Every square was a memory. Every stitch was a piece of herself. "We are," she said. "What will we get for it?" Inez folded the quilt with careful, practiced hands. "Enough flour to see us through to spring. Some salt pork if we are lucky. Perhaps a tin of lard." Rosie nodded the way children nodded when they understood that the situation was serious and that questions would not improve it. Inez wrapped the quilt in a piece of oilcloth she had been saving and tied it with a length of twine. Then she put on every layer she owned, helped Rosie into her coat and her wool hat and her mittens, and led the mare out of the linta behind the cabin. The mare's name was Biscuit, and she was 14 years old and had a bad left foreleg that had never properly healed after a stumble in the summer of 1879. But she was all Inez had, and she was steady, and on a morning like this steady was worth more than fast. The snow was falling in thick curtains that turned the world white and formless. Inez could barely make out the line of the fence that separated her homestead from the open range. She settled Rosie in front of her on the saddle, tucked the oilcloth-wrapped quilt beneath her arm, and urged Biscuit forward into the wall of white. The ride to Harrow Creek took 2.5 hours in that weather. By the time they reached the edge of town, Inez's face was numb and her fingers had gone stiff inside her gloves, and Rosie had fallen into a dozing half-sleep against her arm. The main street of Harrow Creek was nearly empty. The saloon had its lights burning, and there was smoke coming from the chimney of the general store, run by a man named Gideon Pratt, who was not a dishonest man exactly, but who had a gift for making you feel that you were getting a fair deal when you were not. Inez dismounted and tied Biscuit to the hitching post and carried Rosie inside the store in her arms. The warmth hit her like a wall. There was a pot-bellied stove in the center of the room, and it was blazing, and the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs and coffee was so overwhelming after the cold that Inez felt her eyes water. Gideon Pratt was behind the counter, making notations in his ledger. He was a tall, narrow man with a gray beard and small eyes that missed nothing. He looked up when she came in, then looked at the bundle under her arm. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said. "Didn't expect to see anyone from out your direction in weather like this." "I did not expect to be here," she said. She set Rosie down on the bench near the stove and unwrapped the quilt on the counter in front of him. Gideon Pratt looked at it for a long time without touching it. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a man who understood value, and even he could see that this was something unusual. The needlework was precise and intricate, the colors still vivid despite years of use, the batting thick and even. It was the kind of quilt that women in eastern cities paid good money for. "What are you looking for?" he said. 50 pounds of flour," Inez said. 20 pounds of salt pork. A tin of lard and a sack of dried beans. Gideon Pratt sucked air through his teeth and turned the quilt over in his hands. "That's a lot. It is a remarkable quilt, Mr. Pratt, and you know it." "It is a fine quilt," he agreed. "But I'm not in the business of quilts, Mrs. Talmadge. I'd have to find a buyer, and in weather like this, I will take 30 pounds of flour," she said. Her voice did not waver, but it cost her something. "And 10 pounds of salt pork, and the lard." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite pity and not quite respect, but was somewhere between the two. Then he nodded. "I'll give you the 30 of flour and 8 of salt pork and the lard," he said, "and I'll throw in a small sack of cornmeal." It was less than she had hoped for. She had known it would be. She looked at the quilt lying on the counter, this thing that was woven out of her marriage and her youth, and the years before grief had settled into her bones, and she said, "We have a deal, Mr. Pratt." He went to the back to gather her order. Rosie had woken up and was sitting by the stove with her mittens off, holding her small hands out toward the heat with an expression of pure animal relief. Inez stood at the counter and did not look at the quilt again. The door of the general store opened with a blast of cold air and the stomp of boots on the wooden floor, and Inez turned to see a man she did not recognize coming through it. He was tall, significantly taller than average, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite that made up the eastern face of the mountains visible on clear days from her homestead. He wore a heavy canvas coat with a sheepskin collar, and his boots were good quality, well-maintained, and his hat was wide-brimmed and dark. He looked to be somewhere in his middle 30s, and he moved with the particular economy of a man who had spent a great deal of his life outdoors and had learned not to waste motion. He stamped the snow from his boots and pulled off his gloves and looked around the store with the measuring eyes of a man who was accustomed to assessing situations quickly. "I am looking for Gideon Pratt," he said. His voice was low and clear, with the faint edges of somewhere further east that the territory had not entirely worn away. "He is in the back," Inez said. The man looked at her. She was not prepared for the directness of it. He was not rude, there was nothing forward in the look, but he had the kind of eyes that looked at a person rather than past them, and she had not experienced that in some time. "Thank you," he said. Gideon Pratt came back from the storeroom then, carrying the first of her supplies. He set them on the counter and looked up at the tall man, and his face changed slightly in the way that faces changed when someone of financial significance walked into the room. "Mr. Bristol," he said, "I wasn't expecting you until after the New Year." "The New Year is a week away," the man said. He came forward to the counter, and his eye fell on the quilt that was still spread there between Inez's order and the edge of the counter. He stopped. He looked at it the way you looked at something that surprised you, and then he looked at it again the way you looked at something that moved you, which were two different things, and both of them happened one after the other in the span of about 5 seconds. "That's a beautiful piece of work," he said. Gideon Pratt glanced at Inez with something like apology. "Just came in today," he said to the man. "Is it for sale?" Inez felt the words land in her chest like stones dropped in still water. "It has already been sold," she said. "The transaction is concluded." Gideon Pratt cleared his throat. "Well now, Mrs. Talmadge, the transaction is concluded," she said again, and the word came out with more iron than she had intended. The tall man, Theodore Bristol, looked at her with those direct eyes. "I apologize," he said. "I did not intend to complicate your business." She nodded. She did not say anything. He turned to Pratt and began discussing the matter he had come in for, which appeared to involve a substantial order of livestock feed and a replacement part for some piece of ranch equipment that Inez did not follow the details of. He was clearly a man of means. The way Pratt spoke to him confirmed it, deferential, eager, the pen in his hand moving quickly. While they talked, Inez helped Rosie back into her mittens and coat and began loading her purchases into the canvas sacks she had brought for that purpose. The quilt remained on the counter. She wrapped it in the oilcloth again out of habit and then stopped herself and set it down again. It was not hers any more. She picked up the sacks and took Rosie's hand. "Mrs. Talmadge," said Gideon Pratt, I can send my boy Tommy out with those when the weather breaks, if you'd rather not carry them in the storm." "I will manage," she said, because she did not want to owe Gideon Pratt any additional favors, and because she was not sure she trusted Tommy Pratt not to take the long way around. Theodore Bristol was looking at her again. She could feel it without looking directly at him. She pulled Rosie toward the door, hefted the sacks, and pushed out into the cold. The trip home was worse than the trip in. The snow had deepened and the wind had picked up, and it was coming from the north now, driving hard and horizontal across the open ground. Rosie was exhausted and beginning to sag, and Biscuit was laboring. The canvas sacks were heavy across the saddle. Inez kept her eyes on the line of fence posts that she could still just barely make out through the white. She knew this land by instinct after 2 years of working it alone. She knew where the ground dipped and where it rose, and where the creek would be if she wandered too far west. She knew the rhythm of the territory in winter, the way it could turn from merely hard to genuinely deadly in the space of an hour. This was beginning to feel like it might be approaching that second category. Rosie had stopped speaking, which was a sign of cold rather than sleep, and Inez pulled her tighter against her body and urged Biscuit into a careful, faster walk. The mare huffed steam into the air and kept going with the reliable stubbornness of an animal that had endured many Wyoming winters and intended to endure more. They were perhaps 2 miles from the homestead when Inez heard a horse behind her. She turned in the saddle. Through the snow, a dark shape was coming, a rider on a substantial horse, moving at a pace that was faster than the conditions quite warranted. She pulled Biscuit up and waited, because out in open country in a storm you did not ignore approaching riders, and because there was something in the quality of the movement that was not threatening. The rider pulled up alongside her, and she saw that it was Theodore Bristol. He was carrying the quilt across his saddle horn, still wrapped in the oilcloth. "Mr. Pratt told me which direction you lived," he said, without preamble. His voice was slightly breathless from the cold. "I hope that is not an intrusion." Inez looked at him. Her face was too cold for any expression to settle on it naturally. "What is your business, Mr. Bristol?" "I purchased the quilt," he said. "Then it is yours. I am not certain why you are following me with it." He was quiet for a moment. The wind screamed between them and the snow drove sideways, and his horse, a big dark bay with a wide chest and a sensible expression, stood absolutely still in the weather. "Because I saw your face when you left it on the counter," he said. She stared at him. He held the quilt out toward her. "I would like to give it back to you." "I cannot afford to buy it back from you, Mr. Bristol. I have no money." "I am not selling it back. I am returning it. There is a distinction." Inez felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. She had been managing alone for 2 years. She had learned not to accept charity, because charity in the territory came in 2 forms, the kind that was genuinely given and the kind that came back around later with interest attached. She did not know which kind this was. "Why would you do that?" she said. Theodore Bristol looked at her steadily. "Because a woman who rides 2.5 hours in a blizzard with a child and a lame mare to trade her last quilt for flour is clearly in a very difficult situation, and I have more money than I require, and the quilt is worth more to you than to me." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to her in years. Most people in the territory communicated around the edges of things. They did not simply say what they meant in plain words like that. "You cannot know that the quilt is my last," she said, because she was not a woman who gave ground easily. "Is it?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He held it out again. She took it. She did not say thank you immediately because the thing had caught in her throat. She cleared it and said, "Thank you, Mr. Bristol." "Theodore," he said, "we are not at a formal occasion." Despite everything, the cold, the exhaustion, the weight of the last 2 years pressing down on her shoulders, Inez Talmadge almost smiled. "Thank you, Theodore," she said. He rode alongside them the rest of the way home. He did not ask permission to do this. He simply fell into pace beside her at a distance that was respectful rather than presumptuous. and when they crossed the creek bed and he saw that the ice was thin, he guided his horse ahead to test it before she brought Biscuit across, and he did this without making a performance of it, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Rosie, who had been half asleep, woke up enough to look at the large bay horse with the wide-eyed appreciation that small children reserved for large, impressive animals. "What is his name?" she asked. Theodore looked down at her with an expression that was, Inez thought, slightly surprised, as though he had expected the child to be frightened of him rather than curious about his horse. "His name is Major," he said. "Is he in charge?" Rosie said. "Of most things," Theodore said. "Yes." Rosie considered this and nodded seriously and went back to her dozing. The homestead came into view through the snow, the low, dark shape of the cabin with the linta behind it, the fence line marked by its posts, the smoke still curling from the chimney where Inez had banked the fire before she left. It was not much to look at. She had thought that many times in the past 2 years, standing outside it at dusk and trying to see it the way Caleb had seen it, with the pride of a man who had built it and planned to add to it, planned to have a proper house here someday, with a parlor and a second bedroom and maybe a porch. Caleb had not lived to see any of that. Theodore helped her unload the sacks from Biscuit's saddle without being asked, carrying them inside and setting them near the stove with the ease of a man who was comfortable with physical work. She noticed his hands, large, calloused, capable, a working man's hands despite the good coat. She settled Rosie near the stove and stoked the fire and put water on for coffee, because she had a small supply of coffee grounds, and because hospitality was hospitality even at the end of resources. Theodore did not sit until she invited him to. He stood near the door with his hat in his hands and looked around the cabin with the same measuring quality she had noticed in the store, but without judgment in it. He noted the row of canned goods that were almost empty on the shelf, the single blanket on the bed, the rough but carefully mended quality of everything in the room. "You have managed this place alone," he said. It was not a question. "For 2 years," she said. "Since my husband died. I am sorry." "Thank you." She set the coffee pot on the stove. "You have land nearby. I have not seen you in Harrow Creek before." "I came from Colorado," he said. "I purchased the Alderman Ranch last month, the property about 7 miles north of here along the ridge." She knew the Alderman property. Old Carl Alderman had worked it for 30 years before his health gave out and his sons had taken him back to Illinois. It was a substantial spread, nearly 2,000 acres of good grazing land with a reliable water source, and a solid set of buildings that Alderman had improved steadily over his decades there. "That is a serious undertaking," she said. "I have a good foreman," he said, "a man named Holloway who has ranched in Wyoming for 12 years, and a crew of 8 hands, most of whom came up from Colorado with me." He paused. "I have been ranching since I was 20 years old. I know the work." She poured the coffee into the 2 tin cups she had and handed him one. He took it with both hands and wrapped his fingers around it. "Why Wyoming?" she said. He looked at the coffee. "Colorado had gotten complicated," he said. There was a story in those words that he clearly did not intend to tell right now, and she did not press him. "How old is your daughter?" he said. 7. Her name is Rosie." Inez looked at her daughter, who had fallen into a genuine sleep against the wall, her small chest rising and falling in the orange light of the stove. "She is a remarkable child, more capable than most adults I know." "She asked a good question about Major," Theodore said, and there was something in his voice that was warm and almost amused. "She asks good questions about everything," Inez said. "She learned to read when she was 5. I taught her from the Bible and from an almanac and from whatever else I could get my hands on." "The nearest school is in Harrow Creek," he said. 20 miles, she said. "Not exactly practical." He nodded slowly. "No," he said, "I suppose not." They sat for a few minutes with the coffee and the fire and the sound of the storm beating against the cabin walls. It was a strange sort of quiet, the kind that fell between 2 people who did not know each other well enough to fill the silence with words but were not uncomfortable enough to manufacture conversation. "I should get back," Theodore said at last. He stood and put his hat on. "The weather is not improving." "No," she said. "Thank you again for the quilt, and for the escort home." He paused at the door. He seemed to consider something for a moment and then decided against saying it. He nodded to her and went out into the snow. She listened to the sound of Major's hooves departing until they were swallowed up by the storm, and then she went to the window and watched the white until there was nothing to see. That night she spread the quilt over Rosie and sat by the stove with the fire banked low to conserve wood, and she thought about a man with gray at his temples who had ridden back through a blizzard before dark to return something she had given up on. January arrived with a ferocity that even long-time Wyoming residents acknowledged was exceptional. The temperature dropped to levels that cracked boards and froze water solid in the bucket overnight. Inez kept the stove burning around the clock and rationed the wood she had stacked against the cabin wall, counting the days until the worst of it should logically be over. Caleb had always been the one to cut the wood. He had done it in late summer and early fall, stacking it head-high against the south side of the cabin. The first winter after his death, the neighboring family, the Duncans, who lived 4 miles east, had sent their 2 older boys over to help her cut and stack. But the Duncans had left the territory last spring, sold their claim and moved to Oregon, and there was no one within reasonable distance to help now. She had cut what she could manage herself through the fall, but her arm was not what it had been, and the axe handle had developed a crack that she had splinted with twine and hoped would hold. The wood supply would last, she calculated, until the end of February if she was careful. After that, she would have to make decisions she did not want to contemplate. On the 6th of January, a clear day with brilliant blue sky and snow so white it was almost painful to look at, she heard a horse coming from the north. She was outside splitting what wood she had into smaller pieces to make it burn more efficiently, and she shaded her eyes and watched the rider coming down through the field. She recognized Major before she recognized Theodore, the horse's distinctive wide-chested trot and the dark bay color against the white snow. Theodore rode up and dismounted and looked at the axe in her hand, and then at the depleted woodpile, and then at the cracked handle of the axe. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He did not say anything about the woodpile or the axe. He reached into the pack on Major's saddle and produced a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I went into Harrow Creek yesterday," he said. "I thought you might have need of some things." She looked at the parcel. "Mr. Bristol, Theodore," he said. "Theodore," she exhaled. "I cannot accept charity." "It is not charity," he said. "It is neighborly exchange. I am new to this area and I will need to establish relationships with those around me. Having a neighbor who is favorably disposed toward me is in my interest." She looked at him steadily. "That is a very carefully constructed argument." "I thought it was rather good," he said. She took the parcel. Inside were coffee grounds and a slab of dried beef and a paper bag of sugar, and at the bottom a good quality axe handle, smooth and solid with no crack. She looked up at him. "You noticed the handle." "I notice things," he said simply. She stood in the cold January air holding a parcel of supplies and an axe handle, and for a moment she felt something that she recognized with some alarm as the beginning of gratitude that was in danger of becoming something else. She put a firm check on it. "Will you come inside?" she said. "Rosie will want to ask you about Major." He smiled for the first time, really smiled, and it changed his face significantly. It was not a polished smile or a performed one. It came from somewhere genuine, and it lasted only a moment before he composed himself again, but she had seen it. "I would like that," he said. Rosie was indeed delighted. She sat across the table from Theodore and asked him with complete seriousness whether Major had any opinions about the cold, and whether horses dreamed, and whether it was true that a horse could find its way home blindfolded. And Theodore answered every question with equal seriousness and without condescension, which made Inez like him more than she intended to. He stayed for 2 hours. He told them about his childhood in Virginia, about how he had gone west at the age of 20 with $200 and a letter of recommendation from a cousin, and had worked his way from ranch hand to foreman to owner over the course of 15 years. He talked about Colorado with a care that suggested that whatever had made it complicated for him was something he was still in the process of making peace with, and she still did not press. He fixed the axe handle before he left. He did it the way he did everything, without announcing his intention to do it, without asking for permission, simply locating the problem and addressing it with the tools that happened to be in his saddlebag. She watched him work from the cabin doorway and thought that this was a man who had spent his whole life solving the problems directly in front of him, and that there was something very steady in that quality. When he rode away back north, Rosie appeared at Inez's elbow. "I like him," she said. "I know you do," Inez said. "Do you like him?" Inez considered the question with more honesty than she would have applied if the questioner had been an adult. "I think I do," she said. "Yes." "Good," said Rosie and went back inside. He came again 4 days later with a half-quart of firewood loaded on a wagon, along with 2 of his ranch hands, men named Collins and a quiet fellow everyone apparently just called Breckenridge, and the 3 of them stacked it against the cabin wall while Inez stood in the doorway and felt the complicated mix of pride and relief that came with accepting help you needed. She invited all 3 of them in for coffee. Collins was a talkative man from Texas with a long scar above his eyebrow and a cheerful disposition. Breckenridge said very little but had a gentle way with Rosie that the child responded to. Theodore drank his coffee and watched Inez across the table with those direct eyes of his, and when the other 2 were occupied he said, quietly, "How are you managing?" "Better than I was," she said. "The winter will turn in 6 weeks," he said. "Maybe 8. After that the worst of it will be over." "I know the rhythm of it," she said. "This is my 3rd Wyoming winter. Your 3rd alone." "My 2nd alone," he nodded. There was something in his expression then that was neither pity nor admiration but perhaps something of both, and she found that she did not mind it from him the way she minded it from other people. Collins and Breckenridge departed after the coffee. Theodore remained a few minutes longer. "I should not keep calling on you without occasion," he said. "People will talk. People in the territory talk about everything," she said. "It is one of the few entertainments available." "That is true," he said. He turned his hat over in his hands. This, she had noticed, was something he did when he was thinking through something carefully. "I wonder if you would object to my bringing Rosie a book on my next visit. I have a collection that came with me from Colorado, and some of them are appropriate for children." She looked at him for a moment. He was not looking at her directly now. He was looking at his hat. "Rosie would be very glad of a book," she said. "She has read everything we own multiple times." He nodded and put his hat on and went out. He brought the book 3 days later. It was a copy of Swiss Family Robinson, and Rosie received it with a reverence that she normally reserved for particularly significant natural phenomena, and immediately retired to the corner by the stove to begin reading it, shutting out everything else in the world with the complete absorption of a child who loves words. Which left Inez and Theodore at the table with coffee, and a kind of deliberate quiet that neither of them quite knew how to break, because what had begun as practical neighborliness had started, without either of them explicitly acknowledging it, to become something with a different texture. Inez spoke first, because she was not a woman who was comfortable waiting. "You mentioned Colorado had become complicated," she said. "I have been curious about that and I have resisted asking, but I find my curiosity has outlasted my restraint." He looked at her. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he set down his coffee cup and said, "I was married." She kept her expression steady. "Her name was Virginia," he said. "We were married in 1875 in Denver. She was from a good family there. Her father had made money in silver." He paused. "She did not want the life I was building. She wanted Denver, the society of it, the concerts and the parties and the circle of wealthy families her father moved in. I wanted land. I wanted what I am building now. And those 2 things were never going to meet." "What happened?" Inez said. "She left," he said. In the spring of 1879, she went back to her father's house. The divorce was finalized in June of that year. He looked at his coffee. She is remarried now to a lawyer in Denver. I believe she is much happier. And you? He looked up at her. I was not happy for a long time, he said. I threw myself into work, which I understand is a predictable response, but is not a particularly inventive one. I built the Colorado operation into something substantial, and when it was done I realized I had built it to fill an absence and that the absence was still there. He stopped. Is that why Wyoming? She said, partly, he said, and partly because Colorado truly had become complicated. Virginia's family had a great deal of influence in Denver business circles, and her father was not a man who accepted the dissolution of an arrangement graciously. There were obstacles put in my way that I eventually decided were not worth fighting. His jaw set slightly. I am not a man who runs from things, but I am also a man who recognizes when a situation has no resolution available to it. Inez was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I understand that kind of recognition. Do you? Yes, she said. When Caleb died, I had a choice. I could stay and fight for the homestead, or I could go back to Missouri where my family is. My mother wrote and told me to come home. She looked at her hands on the table. But this land is where Caleb's dreams were buried with him, and I did not want to leave them here alone. Theodore looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded that she felt it like something physical, the full weight of a person's attention, without armor or performance. That is a remarkable thing to say, he said. It is just the truth, she said. Most people do not say the truth as plainly as that. Most people have more options for avoiding it, she said. He laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of him. And again it changed. His face opened it up, made him look younger. She thought, he does not laugh often enough. She thought, I would like to hear that more. February settled in cold and deep, but the woodpile held and the flour lasted, and Inez found herself counting the days between Theodore's visits, which had settled into a pattern of every 4 or 5 days, regular as sunrise, with an attention that she finally had to admit to herself was anticipation. She was 31 years old. She had loved Caleb with the whole of her young heart, and his loss had left a wound that she had spent 2 years convincing herself would never close. She had not expected to find herself interested in another man. She had not been prepared for the way Theodore Bristol moved through the world, with that quiet competence and that rare, plain honesty and those eyes that actually looked at her. On a gray Wednesday in the middle of February, he came, and they sat at the table, and Rosie was absorbed in a second book. He had brought a collection of animal stories, and for a while neither of them spoke, and then Theodore said, with the air of a man who had prepared what he wanted to say and was now committed to saying it, I would like, if you are willing, to call on you with purpose. She met his eyes. Purpose, she said. I am not a man who does things without intention, he said. And I find that I have been riding 7 miles in every kind of weather to spend time in this cabin, and I think I should be honest about why. Her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do. And why is that? She said. Because I think about you constantly, he said. Because you are the most remarkable woman I have encountered in a very long time, and I believe, he stopped, took a breath, tried again. I am 36 years old, and I have spent 5 years since my marriage ended convincing myself that I had no use for that kind of connection. And then I rode into Gideon Pratt's store in a blizzard and saw a woman who had ridden 2.5 hours through that blizzard with a child and a lame mare to trade the most precious thing she owned for 30 pounds of flour. And I knew, in the way that you know certain things, that I was not going to be able to think about anything else for a very long time. The fire crackled. Rosie turned a page. Theodore, Inez said, and her voice was not entirely steady. I should tell you that I am not a simple proposition. I am a widow with a 7-year-old child and a homestead that is mortgaged to the extent that I am not certain I can keep it through the spring, and I am someone who has already been split open by love and knows exactly how much it costs. I know all of that, he said, and you are not deterred. I am not, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the quilt he had ridden back through the blizzard to return. She thought about the axe handle and the woodpile and the copy of Swiss Family Robinson. She thought about the laugh she had surprised out of him and the way he answered Rosie's questions with genuine attention. "Then yes," she said, "I am willing." Something shifted in his expression, not relief exactly, more like the settling of something that had been held in suspension. He nodded. He did not reach across the table, did not move toward her in any physical sense. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you, Inez." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it all the way down to her boots. March came in with a week of warm weather that melted the top layer of snow, and then a hard freeze that turned everything to ice. And then, finally, a genuine thaw that brought the mud and the smell of wet earth and the first tentative green suggestions of spring along the creek banks. Theodore rode over every 3 or 4 days, and the nature of the visits had shifted now. There was a formality to them that was also a tenderness, a kind of deliberate courtship that felt old-fashioned and exactly right for the time and place. He always brought something practical, more supplies, or a tool she needed, or once a young laying hen in a crate that he had traded for in Harrow Creek, and Inez always had coffee ready, and they always talked. They talked about everything. About the territory and the way the cattle industry was changing as the railroad pushed further in. About Rosie's education and what could be done to continue it. About Caleb, he asked about Caleb with a directness that she appreciated, not trying to pretend the man had not existed, treating his memory with the respect it deserved. About Virginia, she asked about Virginia with equal directness, and he answered honestly without bitterness, which told her a great deal about his character. On the first genuinely warm Saturday in March, he arrived with a picnic, which was such an unexpected and slightly impractical thing in the context of Wyoming ranching life that she laughed at the sight of him coming across the field with a basket. "It is 35 degrees, she said. "It is 39, he said. "I checked." Rosie thought the picnic was the finest idea anyone had ever had in the history of the territory, and they spread a blanket on the south side of the cabin, where the sun had dried a patch of ground, and ate biscuits and cold chicken and dried apple pie that Theodore had procured from the wife of one of his ranch hands, a Mrs. Holloway who apparently baked on Saturdays out of both generosity and habit. Rosie ran off after 20 minutes to investigate the creek, which had thought enough to be interesting to a 7-year-old, and left Theodore and Inez sitting on the blanket in the thin March sunlight. "She has so much energy," Theodore said, watching her go. "She has been cooped up all winter," Inez said. "She is making up for it," he smiled. He was leaning back on one hand, tilted slightly toward her, and the sunlight on his face made him look different, softer, less contained. She was aware of the exact number of inches between them. "Tell me something you have not told anyone else," he said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want to know you," he said. "Not the practical side of you, the capable side. I want to know the rest." She was quiet for a moment. The creek burbled and Rosie's distant voice could be heard narrating something to herself or to the water. "I am terrified of failing Rosie," she said. Not in the physical sense, not of failing to feed her or keep her warm, though that is also a fear. I mean failing her in the larger sense, raising her in poverty and isolation and watching her possibilities narrow because of where we ended up. She paused. "Caleb and I had plans for her, a real education, a future that was not just surviving." Theodore listened without interrupting. "I sometimes lie awake at night and wonder if staying here was the right choice," she said. "If I should have gone back to Missouri. My mother has a house, and there is a school there, and Rosie would have cousins her age and a real roof, and—" She stopped. "And then I look out the window at the land in the morning and I cannot make myself go." "Why not?" he said, gently. She looked at the mountains, visible now through the clear spring air, massive and white and indifferent. "Because Caleb believed in this place," she said. "He believed that if you put your hands into this land and worked it honestly, it would give you something real, and I am not ready to say he was wrong." Theodore was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He was not wrong." She looked at him. "I have seen dozens of operations in this territory in Colorado and further," he said. "Good land, worked honestly, gives back. It takes time and it takes capital at the start and it takes not being alone with it, but it gives back." He held her gaze. "You should not have been alone with it." She felt the tightening in her throat that preceded tears and refused to give into it. "No," she said, "I should not." He reached across and put his hand over hers. It was the first time he had touched her, and they both went very still for a moment. And then her fingers turned and wrapped around his, and they sat like that in the thin March sunlight while Rosie talked to the creek. April brought the real thaw, and with it, the re-emergence of the world. Mud and blossoms and calves born in the new grass, and the mountains losing their winter white from the bottom up. Inez planted a kitchen garden behind the cabin and Theodore rode over and helped her turn the soil. And they worked side by side in the spring afternoon, while Rosie helped by moving worms from one place to another for reasons she considered important. He had met with Gideon Pratt in Harrow Creek and quietly paid off the balance of the lien against Inez's homestead, which she discovered when Pratt sent her a letter informing her the debt was cleared. She had ridden to the Alderman Ranch, now the Bristol Ranch, though he had not changed the name yet, in a state of controlled fury, which she recognized even as she rode was partly fury and partly something that was overwhelmed and did not know how else to express itself. He was in the yard when she arrived, working with Holloway on the fence line near the barn. He saw her face as she dismounted and sent Holloway away with a quiet word. "You paid my debt," she said. "I did," he said. "Without asking me. I knew you would not allow it if I asked." "Theodore," she stopped, pressed her hands together. "I cannot be something that you acquire. I cannot be a situation that you solve." He looked at her and his expression was earnest in a way that she had rarely seen on him, stripped of the usual composure. "That is not what I intended," he said. "I intended, Inez, I intend to ask you to marry me. Not immediately, not if you are not ready. But that is my intention, and it seemed wrong to ask you while a debt like that was hanging over you, because then you could not be certain whether you were saying yes to me or yes to the solution." She stared at him. "I wanted it to be clear," he said. "That is all. I wanted the question to be clean." The fury went out of her all at once, replaced by something that was not quite that soft feeling she associated with girlhood romance, but was warmer and more solid than that, was something built of knowing someone, of having watched them move through the world for 4 months and found them to be what they appeared to be. "You are a very strange man," she said. "So I have been told," he said. "If you ask me," she said carefully, "what I will say is that I need more time. Not because I am uncertain about you, but because I am certain about what promises cost, and I will not make them lightly." "I know that," he said. "And if you ask me in 3 months," she said, "and I am still feeling what I am presently feeling, the answer will be yes." He looked at her with those eyes for a long, still moment. "I can wait 3 months," he said. "Good," she said. Then, because the anger was entirely gone and she felt suddenly very aware of the spring morning and the smell of the new grass, and the fact that he was standing close enough that she could see the gray in his eyes, she said, "Theodore." "Yes." "I think you should stop waiting for 3 months to be up and simply kiss me." He did. It was not a dramatic kiss, not the kind that happened in the novels that sometimes circulated through Harrow Creek and were read by half the women in the county. It was careful and direct, like everything he did, and his hands came up to hold her face with a steadiness that made her feel that nothing about this was accidental, that he was completely and deliberately present in it. She felt it in her chest, the real interior of it, the place that had been shut and locked for 2 years. She stepped back after a moment and looked at him and said, "I am not going to be able to keep pretending I need 3 months." He looked at her with an expression that was warmer than any she had seen from him, warm all the way through, not just the surface. "You don't need to," he said. May was courtship in the full flower of it, and Inez felt slightly ridiculous and entirely unashamed. Theodore came every other day and sometimes more. He brought Rosie more books and took her fishing in the creek one afternoon. the two of them sitting on the bank with poles cut from willow branches, while Inez watched from the cabin door and felt something reknit inside her that she had thought was permanently torn. Rosie caught a small trout, and Theodore caught nothing, and both of them seemed entirely satisfied with the outcome. He took Inez to a dance in Harrow Creek on a Saturday in May, the first dance she had attended since before Caleb got sick, and she wore her best dress, which was a dark blue calico that was 3 years old and clean, and he wore his good coat and a white shirt, and they danced on the wooden floor of the Harrow Creek Community Hall to the fiddle and the squeeze box while Rosie sat with Mrs. Holloway and ate molasses cookies and watched with frank interest. He danced well for a large man. She told him so. He told her she danced like she did everything else, as though she had already decided how it was going to go. "Is that a criticism?" she said. "It is one of my favorite things about you," he said. She looked up at him, she came to about his shoulder and thought that she had not expected this. She had not expected, when she dragged that quilt off the cedar chest in January, that by May she would be standing on a dance floor in Harrow Creek with her hand in the hand of a man who made her feel like the ground was more solid under her feet than it had been in years. "Theodore," she said. "Yes. Ask me now." He stopped dancing. They stood in the middle of the floor while other couples moved around them, and the fiddle kept playing, and he looked at her with an expression of complete and unself-conscious seriousness. "Inez Talmadge," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He smiled then, the full smile, not the short one, and it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and she laughed because he looked so happy and because she felt so happy, and it was an uncomplicated happiness that she had not known in a very long time. He picked her up briefly, which was entirely impractical and wonderful. The people around them stopped and looked, and someone started clapping, and the fiddle player, who understood his audience, launched into something livelier. Rosie appeared at Inez's elbow with a cookie in each hand and her eyes very wide. "Are you going to get married?" she said. "We are," Inez said. Rosie considered this. She had, Inez reflected, been considering it for months, with the analytical attention she brought to all significant questions. "Good," she said finally, with the air of someone whose opinion had been confirmed. "Can Major come live with Biscuit?" Theodore crouched down to Rosie's level. "Major can absolutely come live with Biscuit," he said, "and I was hoping, if it would be agreeable to you, that you would come live with both of them." Rosie looked at him steadily. "At the big ranch," he said, "with the barn that has the weather vane shaped like a rooster. That is the one." She nodded with great solemnity. "I will consider that," she said, and went back to her cookies, leaving Theodore looking up at Inez with an expression that was somewhere between bemused and entirely charmed. "She is extraordinary," he said. "I know," Inez said. They were married in June, on a warm and clear day when the sky over the Wyoming territory was the particular shade of blue that only existed there and could not be adequately described to people who had not seen it. The ceremony was held at the community hall in Harrow Creek, performed by Pastor Enright, who was a broad, kind man who had presided over half the marriages and most of the funerals in the county for 15 years. Inez wore a dress that Mrs. Holloway had helped her make from fabric Theodore had ordered from the dry goods catalog, a soft ivory lawn with small buttons down the front, and a collar of eyelet lace. It was not an extravagant dress, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and she stood at the front of the community hall and looked at Theodore standing there in his dark coat with his hat in his hands, and his expression that of a man who could not quite believe his luck, and she thought, "I did not see this coming." And that is, perhaps, the point. Rosie served as ring-bearer with an expression of grave responsibility that made half the room smile. Colin stood as Theodore's witness, having apparently elevated himself to best man by sheer force of personality and a willingness to reorganize everyone else's plans. Holloway was there with his wife, and a dozen other ranchers and townspeople who had come as much out of affection for the event as connection to either party. Gideon Pratt came, which surprised Inez slightly, and he gave her a nod of something that was, she thought, genuine congratulation, and she thought that perhaps he was not as purely commercial a creature as she had sometimes supposed. When Enright pronounced them married and Theodore took her face in both his hands and kissed her, with the same careful, deliberate quality that had first unlatched something in her chest back in April, the room made the particular sound of a group of people who are collectively moved and are attempting to express it through noise. Rosie, beside them, said, "Finally," which she had clearly been saving. They moved to the Bristol ranch in July. Inez brought very little her clothes, her kitchen things, the Bible, a few tools, the almanac from which she had taught Rosie to read, and the quilt, carefully folded and wrapped in the same oilcloth as the day she had almost lost it, which she placed at the bottom of the cedar chest that Theodore moved into the bedroom of the main house. The main house was considerably larger than the cabin, 4 rooms, with a parlor that had real chairs and a bedroom, and a room that became Rosie's, which she accepted with the same gravity she brought to all significant gifts, examining every corner before declaring it satisfactory. Theodore gave Rosie a shelf for her books and promised to keep adding to it. Inez stood in the kitchen of the ranch house on their first morning there and looked out the window at the mountains and felt the specific quality of a life that was changing in a direction she had not anticipated and was discovering she had needed. She made coffee on the proper iron stove and set 2 cups on the table, and Theodore came in from the early morning feeding with hay in his hair and his coat smelling of horse and the cold mountain air, and she handed him his coffee, and he looked at her over the rim of the cup with that steady, direct look and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Bristol." She felt it all the way down to her boots, just as she had felt her name on his lips the first time. "Good morning," she said. The summer was the fullest she had known in years, work and purpose, and the particular pleasure of building something with someone else. She kept her hand in the kitchen garden and started a larger one behind the ranch house. She learned the operations of the ranch with the same thorough attention she applied to everything, understanding the rhythms of the cattle work and the water management and the rhythms of the crew. The crew had varying reactions to their new employer's wife. Collins was enthusiastic and vocal about it. Breckenridge remained quiet but was consistently courteous. The other men fell into line after observing for 2 weeks that Mrs. Bristol knew exactly what she was doing and would not be managed or diminished, which earned her the kind of practical respect that working men in the territory gave to demonstrated competence rather than social position. Holloway's wife, Nora, became a genuine friend, a sturdy woman of 40 with a dry sense of humor and a wealth of practical knowledge about managing a ranch household that she shared freely and without condescension. She taught Inez how to put up preserves in the large quantities required for a crew that size, and Inez taught her the needlework patterns she had learned from her grandmother in Missouri, and they spent evenings at the kitchen table over both of these things while their husbands sat on the porch and discussed cattle prices and the prospects for the coming season. Rosie flourished. Theodore arranged for a teacher, a young woman named Miss Hartwell who came out from Harrow Creek 3 days a week, to instruct Rosie and also the 3 children of the Holloway family who were of school age. They set up the schoolroom in the front parlor on those days, and the sound of children reciting multiplication tables filled the house, and Theodore, who worked nearby when the teaching was in session, told Inez one evening that he had not known how much he had missed that particular sound. She looked at him over the supper table. "Did you want children of your own?" she said. He met her eyes. "I thought about it with Virginia. But it seemed, given how things were going, better not to complicate the situation further." He paused, and then there was a period when the question seemed closed. He looked at her steadily. "It does not seem closed now." She felt warmth move through her. "No," she said, "it does not." They sat with that for a moment, both aware of the particular intimacy of the conversation and both, Inez thought, somewhat new to the experience of having this kind of conversation with someone who listened with that quality of full attention. "I would like that," he said, "if you are willing, and if you are not, I understand." "I am 31," she said, "and in good health, and Rosie has been asking me when she is going to have someone to teach things to." She smiled. "So I think the answer is that I am very willing." He reached across the table and took her hand. Autumn came in gold and red, and the particular sharp sweetness of the Wyoming air turning cold again. The cattle had done well over the summer. The calves were strong, and Theodore negotiated a good price with a buyer out of Cheyenne. Collins rode into Harrow Creek with the news and came back with a bottle of whiskey, which was shared around the bunkhouse with appropriate celebration. Inez stood on the porch in October and watched the first snow begin to fall, just a dusting, nothing like what was coming, and thought about January, about the blizzard and the quilt and the ride to Harrow Creek. It seemed like a different life. It seemed like something that had happened to a woman who was somehow both her and not her, a woman who was carrying a weight that had just been redistributed, spread over two sets of shoulders instead of one, and so had become bearable. Theodore came out and stood behind her and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and they watched the snow together without speaking. He was warm and solid and there, and that was everything. "A year ago I had never heard your name," she said. "Less than a year," he said. "January was 11 months ago. Are you correcting me?" "I am," he said. "I am a precise man." She laughed and turned in his arms to face him. He looked down at her with an expression that was entirely without armor, without any of the careful composure she had seen him maintain for so long in the early months. He looked at her as though he could look at her for the rest of his natural life and find the endeavor worthwhile. "I love you," she said. She had said it before, but it still felt like a deliberate act, a willingness to stand in a certain kind of exposure. "I love you," he said, "more than I have words for. And I am generally a man who can find words for things." She reached up and touched his face. The snow came down around them, soft and unhurried, and in the house behind them she could hear Rosie's voice raised in some animated argument with one of the Holloway children, and the sound of the fire and the smell of supper on the stove, and it was not a grand life or a glamorous one. It was real and present and built from something true. In the spring of 1882, Inez gave birth to a son. Theodore was present, which was not, in the Wyoming territory of that year, a universal practice, but which he had firmly indicated he intended to be, and which she had appreciated without making any comment about it. Nora Holloway served as midwife, competent and calm throughout, and the birth was not easy, but it was not a catastrophe. And when it was over and the baby was in Inez's arms and Theodore was kneeling beside the bed looking at his son with an expression she had never seen on any human face before and would not find an adequate word for, she thought, "This is the moment I will carry longest." They named him Samuel Caleb Bristol. Samuel for Theodore's father, who had been a good man by all accounts and had died when Theodore was 12. Caleb for the man who had broken the ground and built the cabin and loved Inez through the years that made her who she was. Theodore had suggested Caleb himself without prompting on an evening when they were discussing names. She had looked at him and said, "Are you certain?" And he had said, "He was Rosie's father and your first love and the man whose work built the life you were defending when I met you. He deserves to be remembered." And she had pressed her face into his shoulder and let herself, for one private moment, cry. Samuel Caleb Bristol entered the world in April when the meadows were turning green, and the sky was the impossible Wyoming blue, and he was a large, healthy boy with Theodore's jaw and Inez's dark eyes, and an opinion about everything that he expressed loudly and without hesitation, which Inez felt was appropriate. Rosie, now 8, took one look at her brother and immediately declared herself in charge of his education. She had, she explained to anyone who would listen, a great deal to teach him, and she intended to begin as soon as he was capable of holding a book. Theodore told her that might be a few months yet. Rosie said she was prepared to wait. The cedar chest in the bedroom still held the quilt. Inez brought it out when Samuel was born and laid it over him in his cradle. The quilt made from her wedding dress and Caleb's shirts and the blue calico from Missouri, every stitch a memory, every square a piece of a life that had led, through grief and blizzard and 30 pounds of flour, and a man who rode back before dark, to this one. She stood over the cradle and looked at her son wrapped in the quilt, and felt that she was looking at the precise intersection of everything that had brought her here. Theodore came to stand beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders and they looked at Samuel together, and after a while he said very quietly, "I am grateful for that blizzard." "So am I," she said. "Now, you were not at the time." "I was not at the time," she agreed. "I was freezing," he smiled. "You were also the most determined woman I had ever seen." "I had a 7-year-old and 30 pounds of flour to get home," she said. Determination was not optional. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "No," he said. "I suppose not." The summer of 1882 was a good one for the Bristol ranch. The herd had grown considerably since the previous year, and Theodore had purchased another 300 acres from a neighboring claim, whose owner had given up and gone east, expanding the operation to a size that required 2 additional hands. Collins, who had decided that Wyoming suited him after being thoroughly ambivalent about it for the first year, took on additional responsibilities as the crew expanded, managing the younger hands with the Texas-flavored authority of a man who had seen too much to be impressed by posturing. Breckenridge, who had been quiet and dependable throughout, turned out to speak at considerable length and with great eloquence about the subject of horses, which no one had discovered until he began training a young quarter horse in the autumn, and could be found in the paddock delivering lengthy monologues to the animal on topics ranging from technique to philosophy. Theodore made him the head of the horse operation, which was a decision that pleased both Breckenridge and the horses. Inez managed the household with the same organized thoroughness she brought to everything, but she was also increasingly involved in the business side of the operation. She had a head for figures and a memory for prices, and a talent for the kind of negotiation that did not look like negotiation, which Theodore noticed and valued and told her so directly, which she appreciated. There was a question in the territory at that time that touched everything, including the ranching community, and it was not one that could be avoided even if one wanted to. The land was not empty when the settlers came. The Arapaho and Shoshone peoples, whose territory this had been for generations, had been progressively pushed from it through a combination of treaty violations and military pressure, and the implacable spread of homesteads and cattle operations. And this was a truth that sat uncomfortably in the center of the life that people like Inez and Theodore were building. Theodore had a pragmatic and unsentimental view of most things, but this was one where his pragmatism failed to provide comfort, and he said so. On an evening in late summer, they were sitting on the porch after supper, and he said, "We are sitting on land that was someone else's before it was the government's, before it was mine." Inez looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I do not know what to do with that," he said. "I do not think there is anything tidy to do with it," she said. "It is an injustice that is already done and cannot be undone by our awareness of it, but I think being aware of it is still required. I think pretending it is not true because the truth is inconvenient is a different order of thing." He nodded slowly. "When the Arapaho came through in the spring to hunt along the creek, Holloway wanted to turn them off," he said. "And," she said, "I told him they were welcome to hunt the creek for as long as they needed," Theodore said. "It is not adequate, but it was what was available to me." She put her hand over his on the arm of the porch chair. "It was something," she said. He looked at her. "You do not soften things." "No," she said. "I find softening things is generally more comfortable for the person softening than for anyone else." He smiled, the real smile, the one she still felt she had earned each time she saw it. "I knew from the moment I saw you on that counter that you were someone who did not soften things," he said. "Across a counter," she corrected. "We were both at it," he said, "as I recall. You were making a transaction with Gideon Pratt. I was looking at a quilt," he said, "and then I was looking at you." She shook her head, but she was smiling. The autumn of 1882 brought a visitor that neither of them expected. On a clear October afternoon, a carriage arrived at the ranch bearing a well-dressed man of about 50 who introduced himself as Mr. Gerald Whitmore of St. Louis, Inez's uncle on her father's side, a man she had met perhaps twice in her childhood and not seen since her marriage. He had apparently tracked her through a sequence of correspondence that had passed through her mother in Missouri, and he arrived with the particular air of a man who considered himself to be bearing news of importance. He was not wrong, exactly. He bore a letter from her mother informing her that Inez's grandmother, her mother's mother, who had come from Virginia before the war and brought with her a small inheritance of land and a house in the town of Rolla, Missouri, had died in August at the age of 91 and had, in her will, left a portion of her estate to Inez. The portion was not vast. It amounted to a sum of just over $300 and a trunk of goods including some furniture and the sewing materials that had belonged to her grandmother's mother before her. But it was more than Inez had held in her own name since before Caleb died, and the sewing materials were beyond price: fine needles and thread and beautiful fabrics, including 3 panels of silk that her grandmother had never used. She stood holding the letter for a long time. Theodore watched her from across the room and did not speak until she looked up. "Good news," he said. "She was 91, Inez said. "She had a full life. She was still sharp as anything at the end, my mother says." She folded the letter. "She always said she would leave me her sewing things. She taught me needlework when I was small." "Then she kept her word," he said. "She always did," Inez said. And then she went to him, which was something she did when she needed to stand very near something solid, and he put his arms around her, and she stood with her face against his shoulder for a few moments, thinking about a woman she had loved in childhood who was now gone, and feeling the weight of time and generation, and the way that things were passed down through hands. The trunk arrived by freight wagon in November. Inez opened it in the parlor with Theodore and Rosie watching, and removed the fabrics and the needles and the spools of silk thread with the care of someone handling something sacred. Rosie, who by now was 9 and beginning to have opinions about aesthetics, declared the silk fabrics to be the most beautiful things she had ever seen. That winter, Inez began making another quilt. She made it over the course of 4 months, working in the evenings by lamplight after Samuel was asleep and Rosie was doing her lessons. It was different from the first quilt, not made of memories exactly, but made of presents. She used the silk panels from her grandmother's trunk and scraps from Rosie's outgrown dresses, and a square cut from the sleeve of Theodore's canvas work coat that she had mended through the winter. She put in a piece of the ivory lawn from her wedding dress. She put in a fragment of the blue calico that had originally come from Caleb's mother in Missouri and had been part of the original quilt. She had carefully saved a small piece when repairing the first quilt the previous spring. Theodore watched her work on it sometimes in the evenings, sitting across the fire from her with a book, and occasionally he would look up and watch her hands moving and then go back to his reading without saying anything, which was one of the things she loved about him. He understood the value of being present without turning everything into words. One evening in February he looked up from his book and said, "What is that one made of?" She held it up so he could see the pieces. "This is a panel from grandmother's silk," she said. "This is from the dress Rosie wore on her first day of school here. This is from your coat." He looked at the piece of canvas coat. "You cut up my coat, a piece I saved from the tear I mended," she said, "which you would have known if you had paid attention when I mended it." He smiled. "And this piece," he indicated the fragment of blue calico. "That was in the first quilt," she said. "Caleb's mother sent it to us when we married. I saved a piece." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "So both of them are in it?" "Yes," she said, "Caleb and you, the whole of it." He looked at her with that expression she had come to know as his most unguarded, the one with no composition to it, just the thing itself. "I am honored to be in the same quilt," he said. "You should be," she said. "It is a very good quilt." He laughed. Samuel's first birthday arrived in April, and was celebrated with the level of ceremony appropriate to the occasion, which Rosie considered to be substantial, and which Theodore implemented with the thoroughness of a man who had decided that domestic celebrations were worthy of the same organizational attention as cattle operations. There was cake, a proper one, baked by Inez and decorated by Rosie with whatever she could find, which resulted in a configuration that was more enthusiastic than elegant. Collins and several of the other hands came in from the bunkhouse. Nora Holloway brought molasses cookies. Samuel, presented with his first taste of cake frosting, expressed his opinion of it with the vocal enthusiasm that characterized his approach to all strong preferences. Theodore watched his son with the expression Inez associated most deeply with him now. Not the composed rancher, not the careful businessman, not even the deliberate suitor from those January evenings. This was the face of a man who had found, after a long and sometimes difficult path, the thing that made the rest of it make sense. She caught his eye across the room, and he held her gaze, and what passed between them needed no words, which was fortunate because the room was too loud for any. Summer came again, and with it a second pregnancy that Inez discovered in July and told Theodore about on a Thursday evening while they were doing the farm accounts, a gloriously mundane moment that she felt was entirely appropriate for an announcement that was going to reorder things considerably. He set down his pen. He looked at her. He said, "Are you well?" "Very," she said. He got up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and knelt down beside her chair, which put them nearly at eye level, and took both her hands. "I love you," he said. "I want to say that first before anything else." "I know," she said. "And then I want to say that this is Inez." He stopped. He pressed her hands. "This is more than I had imagined having." "Is that good?" she said, though she already knew the answer. "That is more good than I can express," he said. She touched his face. The evening light came through the window and lay across the kitchen, and outside the horses were moving in the paddock, and inside the house her children, because that was what Rosie was, her child, wholly and without qualification, were both, for a rare concurrent moment, asleep. "Theodore," she said, "we have done something very fine here." He turned his face into her hand for a moment. "We have," he said. The second child arrived the following March. It was a girl this time. A small, dark-haired, immediately opinionated person who came into the world with a cry that Nora Holloway said she could hear from the yard, which, given that Nora Holloway had seen many births and was not easily impressed, was considered a significant assessment. They named her Eleanor Margaret Bristol Eleanor for Theodore's mother, who had been a quiet and determined woman who had raised 3 boys largely alone after his father died, and who deserved, he said, to have someone loud and difficult named after her. Margaret for Inez's mother, still living in Missouri, who cried when she received the letter and whose reply arrived 6 weeks later full of advice, recipes, and the kind of specific love that only existed between a woman and the daughter she had watched grow into herself. Rosie, at 10, examined her new sister with the analytical precision she brought to every significant new phenomenon. "She looks," Rosie said, "like she will be trouble." "Almost certainly," Theodore said. "I approve," Rosie said, and went back to her book. Samuel, at nearly 2, was uncertain about Eleanor for approximately 3 days, and then transferred all of his considerable enthusiasm for the world to the project of explaining it to her, which he began immediately and continued for as long as anyone was present to observe. The quilt, the second one, the one made of both histories, went into Eleanor's cradle when she arrived, just as the first had gone into Samuel's. The first quilt had been returned to the cedar chest with the care it deserved, alongside Theodore's letters from his mother and Inez's Bible, and the things that were too precious for daily use, but too important for storage where they could not be found. The ranch continued to grow. By the end of 1883, the Bristol operation was one of the more established in that part of the Wyoming territory, known for the quality of its stock and the reliability of its business practices, and less formally, for the fact that the Bristols were good neighbors who brought supplies to families in difficulty without making a production of it, and who kept their word. Collins had, by this time, decided that Wyoming was unequivocally his home, and had married a woman from Harrow Creek named Dora who was as talkative as he was, which made their household an eventful one. Breckenridge had acquired a reputation for horse training that extended beyond the immediate area, and had begun, with Theodore's encouragement, a small but serious operation of his own on a few acres of leased land adjacent to the ranch. Miss Hartwell, who had been Rosie's teacher, married a young doctor who came to Harrow Creek in the fall of 1883, which everyone considered a satisfactory outcome. A new teacher was engaged, a young man named Mr. Peters, who was earnest and knowledgeable and slightly overwhelmed by Rosie's questions, but was proving adequate to the challenge. On a morning in the spring of 1884, a May morning with the sky doing its particular Wyoming thing, and the meadows green and the creek running high with snowmelt, Inez was in the kitchen garden and Theodore was working at the fence line nearby, and Rosie and Samuel were somewhere in the direction of the barn, and Alina was in the kitchen in her basket enjoying the morning, and the sounds of all of this were layered together in the spring air. Theodore came over to where she was working and leaned on the fence between the garden and the field. He had hay in his hair and he smelled of horse and work in the spring morning, and she looked up at him with the particular quality of looking that came from knowing someone so thoroughly that you could read the weather in their expression. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to look at you. You are interrupting my garden." "Your garden will survive," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly. He was watching her with a straightforward, uncomplicated warmth that had not diminished in the 3 years since they married, which she considered, given what she knew of how things could diminish, to be remarkable. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Then tell me." He looked at her steadily. "In January of 1881, he said, "I rode into Gideon Pratt's store in a blizzard because I needed to sort out an order for the ranch. And I saw a woman behind the counter who had clearly ridden a very long way in very bad weather and was conducting a transaction that was costing her more than the practical components of it. And I did not think anything articulate. I just knew that I could not let her leave without doing something about the fact that she was leaving something behind that she should not be leaving behind." Inez looked at him. "I thought," he said, "that I was returning a quilt. I discovered over the following months that I was doing something rather larger than that." He paused. "I want to thank you," he said, "for letting me, for not turning me away when I showed up with that quilt, for being someone that it was worth riding back through a blizzard before dark for." She looked at him for a long moment with the spring morning around them, and the sounds of their children in the middle distance, and the mountains rising at the edge of everything, white at the top and green at the bottom, and so massive and indifferent and beautiful that you had to make your peace with them being larger than you, or spend your whole life in their shadow. She stood up and walked to the fence and stood on her side of it, and he was on his side of it, and they were facing each other, and she said, "Theodore, yes, you did not rescue me," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said, "I was managing." "You were," he said, "admirably." But she stopped. She looked at his face, at the gray in his hair and the lines that the sun and the wind had put around his eyes over 15 years of working outdoors, at the expression that was patient and present and entirely his. "But I am very glad," she said, "that you rode back." He reached over the fence and took her hand. "So am I," he said. The spring morning continued around them. Rosie's voice rose from the direction of the barn in some animated instruction addressed to Samuel, who could be heard responding with opinions. Alina made a sound from the kitchen that suggested she was awake and beginning to form views about this. Major and Biscuit moved in the paddock in the unhurried way of horses who were comfortable and well cared for, and had, between them, acquired a companionship that suited them. The cedar chest in the bedroom held the first quilt. the quilt made of a wedding dress and work shirts and blue calico, and the stitches of a young woman in the first year of her marriage who had been sewing her hopes into fabric. It had been to Harrow Creek and back through a blizzard. It had been bartered and returned and folded and unfolded and wrapped around 2 sleeping children and placed with care into the keeping of a household that was not the one that had made it, but that was, in every way that mattered, the right place for it. Inez Talmadge Bristol, who had once been only Inez Talmadge, who had once dragged that quilt off the cedar chest on a January morning, and held it like a child she was about to surrender, stood in her kitchen garden with her husband's hand in hers, and her children's voices in the air, and the Wyoming spring pressing its impossible blue above everything. And she felt the specific and unrepeatable quality of a life that had come through difficulty into something real. She was 34 years old. She had loved 2 men who were each, in their own way, the right man for the part of her life they had occupied. She had a daughter who was going to change the world by sheer force of the questions she asked. She had a son who approached existence with a gladness that was its own kind of gift to everyone who encountered it. She had a daughter who was 8 months old and already opinionated, and who would, Inez suspected, give everyone around her excellent material for the next several decades. She had a husband who had ridden back before dark through a blizzard to return something she had given up on, and who had been riding back ever since, steadily, without dramatics, with the quiet and certain quality of a man who had found where he belonged and intended to remain there. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." "Is the garden done?" he said. "The garden," she said, "will wait." He smiled. He came around the fence gate and fell into step beside her, and they walked back to the house together across the May morning. And the mountains stood above everything the way they always had and always would. And the life that had been built here, on work and loss and a blizzard and a quilt, and the particular kind of courage that was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going through it, was entirely, irreducibly, magnificently theirs. Eleanor had worked herself into a significant announcement by the time they reached the kitchen door, and Theodore scooped her up from her basket with practiced ease, and she grabbed his collar with her small fist and immediately stopped complaining, because she had, from the beginning, a talent for understanding when she had gotten exactly what she needed. He held her against his shoulder and looked at Inez over Eleanor's dark head, and she looked back at him. And between them was everything that had been built and everything that was still being built and everything that would come after that neither of them could yet see. Which was, she thought, the exact right amount to know. She put the coffee on. Outside, Rosie and Samuel came through the yard at a run, Rosie leading and Samuel following with the devoted tenacity of a small person who had decided that his sister's path was the correct one. They came through the kitchen door in a rush of spring air and noise, and the kitchen filled up with life, and the morning came in through the windows, and the fire in the stove burned steady, and in the cedar chest in the bedroom a quilt lay carefully folded with both histories inside it, all its stitches holding.